How's it going, folks? You alright? I'm alright, I think. A few of you may have seen a few weeks back I did a casual video showing off the throttle bots, which was one of my collecting goals for the year. Doesn't matter if you didn't see it, wasn't very professionally done. Well, right after I recorded that, I completed one of my other collecting goals for the year, which was to put together a complete group of combiners. Something I've never really done. As a kid, I had enough of the Scramble City combiners to Frankenstein together something, but it was never that pretty. Since then, I've lost a few of the limbs, and one of them basically crumbled to dust. The only other combiner I ever had was Magnaboss here, which I don't really count as collecting up a combiner, because all these guys came in one box. Wasn't exactly a task to complete, plus this guy's sort of crumbling a little bit, so maybe I'll have to do a review on this one sooner rather than later. So yeah, in terms of actually collecting together the parts of a Gestalt Titan, I've never actually completed a combiner. I wasn't even collecting figures when Combiner Wars was going on. So this year I decided I was going to try to get together a complete combiner, and after looking at a load of G1 bots and Combiner Wars guys, I eventually just decided to go for Studio Series Devastator, of course. Would have been easier and probably cheaper to collect up, say, the Protector bots or something. They're certainly abundant in the UK. Instead, I was wandering around Smith's in Farnborough and I came across Skipjack on a sale price, and I guess that was the start of that. I've mentioned before I've never been too keen on the movie designs, but I have been impressed with pretty much every movie-based figure I've had so far. And despite how awful Revenge of the Fallen was, the whole Devastator sequence was pretty rad, enemy scrotum aside, and I did actually quite like the design. But more on that later. For this review, I hope you'll forgive me being a little bit brief with the bots and their modes. There's 8 of these guys to get through, and they've got 3 modes each, and then there's Devastator itself. This episode is gonna be a long one no matter what. We're going to go through in order of the figure class, starting with the Deluxes, then the Voyagers, and ending with the Leaders. First up is the Deluxe Scrap Metal, and what a lovely figure to start with. He's got one of the more normal style robot designs of the lot, and he's quite a charming little guy, filled with little Bayverse bot style detailing. I really dig the Caterpillar track style legs, which kind of recall the original G1 Bone Crusher design. His torso has that look of an inner robot that's protected by little tiny bits of armour, and it completely disappears when you turn him into vehicle mode. Articulation's pretty decent too, although it's a little bit limited below the thighs. Transformation into Excavator mode is pretty neat, with some clever arm twisting to make up the top side of the vehicle mode. It's not a challenge, but it's all somewhat unique and unexpected. There's a step where you roll the hips down that I never like the feel of, where you have to put a little bit too much pressure on the hip joints to get it to move, which makes me worry about how strong they are. Still, pretty nice digger, and the robot mode has almost entirely vanished, which, as you'll see later, isn't always a guarantee. I'll show you each combined mode when we get to the main event, but next up, here's Hightower. Get a load of this weirdo. Even by Bayverse standards, this is pretty out there, but whether he's the strangest of the team is certainly up for debate. Hightower here feels alien to look at. He trundles around, I assume, on these caterpillar tracks that come out from where you'd think his shoulders are meant to be, but they're not his arms because he's got these little T-Rex arms down here. I do like how the crane arm is just kinda here. It doesn't split apart or tuck away anywhere, it's got nowhere to go, it's just there. Presumably so he can pick stuff up off the ground, because he ain't picking anything up with these arms. Transformation's a bit odd. On paper it's pretty simple, but it's all to do with folding up these arms, legs here, and sort of tucking them in on the underside to form the caterpillar tracks. Not too complex really, but the instructions don't half make it seem more difficult than it really is. Something that's a bit of a common aspect with these movie Constructicons I've found. Hasbro really do need to improve these things. There's a couple of figures I got in the set which are the Takara versions, and the instructions on those are just a little bit clearer despite being basically the same presentation. Anyway, you get a pretty nice crane mode out of this, and the robot mode has almost entirely disappeared, much like with Scrap Metal, which is an aspect I like seeing on these movie bots. Whenever they pull that off, it just feels kind of impressive, you know? Now on to the Voyager sizes, and we're starting with the smallest of the lot, with Mixmaster here. Still takes up a decent amount of space though, with these spindly arms coming out. There's something about this design that doesn't quite sit right with me. The central part of him, the legs and the body, are all pretty normal, but these arms just come right out here and get right in the way. It's like they figured out they were going to hide the arms under the cement mixer drum, but they couldn't really figure out what to do with the drum itself, and just kind of left it hanging there. I think they could have tidied this up a bit, maybe brought the shoulders in, or dropped the cement barrel down the back, or even made the barrel the arms themselves, instead of just kind of hanging off him awkwardly. To make matters worse, the truck cab makes him look like the Hunchback of Notre Dame here. Poor chap. G1 Mixmaster was such a simple design, looking exactly like a cement truck just stood up, but no design cues from this were used here. Still, because of his long limbs and his multitude of joints, he can pose up quite nicely and even pull off quite a decent dab. I hear dabbing is a thing that kids say. Hit like and subscribe, kids. They do dabs in Fortnite. Vehicle mode is very much a cement mixer. Pretty mean entirely grey one that has a front end that reminds me of what Dark of the Moon Megatron may have looked like if he didn't go off the rails and go all post-apocalyptic Mad Max on us. Getting to this mode is a bit of a faff, especially when it comes to clipping together all the barrel parts just right. I swear the first few times I did this it took me about half an hour each time. There's so many little pegs that have to snap together just right to get it there. The nose of the cab never seems to sit quite right for me. It comes off in the process of getting to the combine mode and it just doesn't seem to tab in perfectly. That said, it's a mostly successful vehicle mode with a few little foibles in the process of getting here, along with some very visible robot feet at the back. Next up is Scrapper here, and this may be my favourite of the lot. There's a couple of others in contention, but I can't deny how much of a solid guy this character is. Some of the Constructicons have some pretty out there robot modes, but this guy's mostly keeping it normal, although there's still some alien-esque design there, such as the asymmetrical arms and the squished up little face there. Isn't it adorable? I love how the legs are just loads of bits of vehicle cobbled together into leg shapes. The way these work in transformation is all kind of nuts too. Articulation's as you'd expect, but you can be impeded in a few places. But it's not too bad, you just lose a few degrees of articulation here and there. Transformation into a scoop, loader, digger thing, I don't know what these are called, is pretty clever and inventive. Yes, I've said that about a few of these, but it's still correct here. Like the scoop at the front is a combination of the arms and legs, all wrapping around and coming together at the front, plus they articulate in unison once they're in place. There's a few clearance issues here and there during transformation, but there's not much in the way of paint apps on this guy, so I'm not too worried about anything getting scratched off in the process. Now the vehicle mode doesn't hide all the robot parts, but they're so twisted and contorted out of their original positions you're kind of not really sure what parts you're looking at. You can see a few parts that don't quite look like a real world vehicle, but they look so heavy and industrial that it works quite well. Also, he rolls around better than most of the set, which is quite nice. Seriously, why is it so difficult for Transformers to just roll along properly? They turn into cars, it's the main thing cars do. Moving on, here's Skipjack, the screen-accurate left leg of Devastator. This guy is the one repaint of the crew, having initially been released in red under the name Rampage. This was the first member of the team I got, and he served as a pretty apt introduction to the constructed crew. He basically ticks all the boxes the rest of the team do. He's got a weird looking robot mode, pretty good vehicle mode, slightly perplexing transformation. He's got a pretty decent amount of articulation in these things that are allegedly arms. Quite like the long claws, giving us some rare finger articulation in a Generations toy. At least I think they're fingers. He's also got tiny guns stowed away in the side, but they look kind of rubbish in his hand, so I just put them straight back there. Thanks to his second job as a foot, he's got some pretty meaty articulation here, in order to give him the strength to hold up the rest of Devastator. Apparently some versions of the figure have this misassembled, but my one's fine. But, you know, keep an eye out. Now you know. Didn't know that before I got him, though. You notice he has a distinct lack of legs, which is helped out by coming with his own little stand here, in order to give him some much needed stability. Remember that bit for later. Transformation into this bulldozer mode is pretty straightforward, although there is some pretty fiddly tabbing in to do around here. Also, don't forget to position the wheels out a little bit just so he can roll along freely. Very little visible bot going on this one, although don't look at the back. I do find I rarely get the bar along the side of the Caterpillar tracks lined up perfectly though. Can never quite figure out what I'm doing wrong here. One neat touch is the stand fits in between the Caterpillar tracks here, adding a little bit of stability so they don't go and tilt inwards on themselves. Rounding out the Voyager class guys is Longhaul here, and he is a bulky bot. Just a massive chunk of angry metal. I do really like this design. There's a lot of detail going on. It doesn't feel like random pieces of twisted metal. It feels like bits of bulky armour. You get a decent sense of character too. You can tell he's a bit of a grumpy sod under all of this, miserable from having to carry all this weight around everywhere. The sheer bulk of him does mean that some of the articulation is a little bit impeded by his own heft, which is a bit of a shame because there's a lot of range there if you can make it work. Much like Skipjack, he does have some strong ratcheting on the waist, although it does feel a little bit looser on this one. Gotta say, this may be my favourite bot mode of the lot. He doesn't feel much like a movie character. Would like to see some new takes on this guy, and just saying, Legacy is right around the corner, and its whole thing is doing alternate takes on classic figures. Vehicle mode is a nice chunky dump truck with a bit of the old compromise going on here and there. Getting him there has a few awkward stages, especially when it comes to getting the dump truck bed to cinch up just right. It's one of those things where every part has to line up just right, and there's almost zero clearance to give you leeway in getting the parts in there. I'd forgive that if you could actually dump anything in the truck, but oh look, hands. By the way, it's these hands that I found to be the main issue in trying to get everything lined up. You got to get them pegged in at just the right point to make it work. Other than that though, he does look the part, and he's not the worst example of exposed robot parts. Which, by the way, I don't mind too much. Like, we had nearly 40 years of jet formers where you could see visible robot on the underside of the jet, which is exactly the place you're likely to look at on a real jet. It just feels like here something could have been done with those arms, surely. And now onto the leader class boys, and we're starting with the oddest of the bunch, that being leader class Scavenger. As you can see, he's wide and a very unusual design for a Transformer. Scavenger has a big action scene at the start of Revenge of the Fallen where he wrecks a whole bunch of warehouses and then gets executed by Optimus Prime. But obviously he got better because, he's here and part of Devastator. Good for him. Now, as a design, I do think this is pretty cool, but much like your dad at your 16th birthday party, he will not stand. And it's a bit of a shame because we already had Skipjack with his little stabilising stand there. Why couldn't one have been included with this guy? Worse yet, the bottom of these wheels have flaps that can fold out in certain places. And if they just lined up, you'd be able to make a little stand for him out of the wheel itself. You can sort of balance him up with your hands, but the moment you walk past, he's toppling over and taking at least 5 bots with him. If there was a bit of a difference with the engineering, those flaps could have been used to maybe make a stand for him, although it makes sense that they're like this with the way he transforms. Speaking of, transformation from bot to frick-off big digger is actually pretty straightforward. There's some clever wheel splitting action with the caterpillar treads folding out, which reveals the top wheel to have been a fake out all along. After that, it's just a case of unfurling the shoulders and snapping everything into place. It actually tabs together pretty easily compared to most of the rest of this set. From the sides, this is a pretty good looking giant digger that wouldn't look out of place inside a sandpit with a kid's Tonka toys. Unfortunately, it all falls apart when you look at it from literally any other angle. The inner wheel is just fully there, there's not even a flap to cover his shame. The back end is just a big open mess of Bayformer bits, and it's a bit of a shame because he was so close. Still, because he's impossible to stand up in robot mode, this did become the default display mode for him. And somehow, despite being a huge digger, he still takes up less space than the robot mode does. I do enjoy the mess that is Scavenger, even if it is just for the weird ass robot mode. Next up, if you thought Scavenger was wide, then you ain't seen Overload yet. Look at the width on this thing. Granted, it's all arms, 4 of them to be exact, but even without that, he'd still be a pretty chunksome figure. All those arms are articulated all over the place, and even the shoulders have some heavy ratcheting going on. The guy forms the trousers of Devastator, so he needs all that heavy ratcheting to hold everything that goes on top of him. Unfortunately, my figures come with some slightly loose hip joints that won't quite sit in place. Thankfully, they aren't load-bearing when combined, though. Overload turns into this huge articulated dump truck thing, which is, I assume, a real vehicle that looks like this. He gets there by sort of doing a long stretch and hiding all the spiky parts that can't be passed off as being part of a real Earth vehicle. Mostly anyway. There's a middle bit that kind of sticks out a little bit, and there's a pair of spiky claws that are barely covered by what I think is meant to be a plain turbine engine, but also forms like a scarf for Devastator's neck, to give that spinning turbine effect he has in the film. Bit of an unsightly gap up the front that probably could have done with a flap to cover it up. Especially when you look in there, you can just see Overload sort of peeking out a little bit. I can cut him a bit of slack though, because on his own he has to combine with 3 members of the team. 4 if you count the neckerchief here. And he's also got to take the majority of Devastator's weight. He's got a lot on, literally. Now, speaking of the full team combining, I guess that's what's next. Bear with me here, because a few weeks back I did actually record a more casual look at all these figures, and I spent, no word of a lie, 90 minutes just getting them transformed and combined together into the Devastator mode. I combined them together for the first time in that video, and I thought it'd be nice to get my initial reactions then. By the end I was just kind of tired though, but not this time, because now I have the power of experience and script writing to make sure this comes out a little bit better at least. So, with that all said, shall we devastate? Now, that wasn't so bad, was it? Especially as I sped it all up for you. For me, it was a bit of an ordeal, but am I glad that I kept the instructions for these things? Most of them are pretty easy to get into their combined forms, especially the hand guides and overload. Skipjack is a bit confusing as he involves a whole lot of twists that don't come into play in any other modes, and I'm never quite sure I've got it right because his instructions are the worst. Getting Hightower and Scrap Metal to link together can be a little bit tricky because the instructions make it look like you're supposed to push the combiner section further back than you really have to. By far the worst part of combining Devastator is the head though. I like the way Mixmaster has the head all hidden away inside the truck cab, and it is a really nice sculpt. The way he connects to Scavenger is maddening. You have to connect the inside of the wheels to a bar in there while also attaching a pair of little clips to some smaller bars just behind it. If you slip, it'll just send the guy flying. Solidly in place once it's done though. Still, couldn't have just had some sort of fold out clip like all the others. I know I sound like I'm complaining a bunch, but combining him really isn't that bad. It's just the strangeness of combining him. There aren't really any other combiners out there that come together like this one does. Normally you'd have uniform connectors and one central guy to work around, but this guy has none of that. The closest combiner to this would be Magnaboss or Tripredicus, but even then you're only dealing with 3 separate bots. Once this is all combined though, and I'm sure you can see, he has quite some presence. Devastator is just massive, at least for a bot in my collection anyway. He just about stands a little bit taller than Armada Unicron, and I don't consider him to be small at all. Granted, there are bigger robots out there like Titan classes and G1 Fortress Maximus and that new Unicron figure, but I don't have any of those, so for me this guy is a behemoth. Who has room for that many Titans anyway? I do like how Devastator looks like a whole bunch of industrial vehicles all smushed together into a man-shaped mess. He doesn't crawl around on all fours like he does in the film, and there is a way of doing that, but it doesn't feel safe to me. But he still looks mean, even if he is lacking an enemy scrotum. Also, poor Overload's head is just hanging out here. Can't he ever get any privacy? Believe it or not, there's actually quite a lot of articulation here on the arms and legs. A lot more than you might expect on a figure this size. There's shoulder joints and bicep swivels and even a little bit of wrist movement. There's even a little bit of sideways elbow action. And his fingers, if you can call them that, are all fully articulated as well. Legs are articulated as well, with plenty of heavy ratcheting, which I mentioned earlier in the video, and you will be glad it's there too. Could not imagine this thing standing up as stably as it does without those ratchets. No neck movement to be had, but his jaw does open and close, which is nice. So yeah, Devastator is one incredible combiner. Should he have been the first one I collected? Probably not. It's a pricey endeavour, although I did get most of these for cheaper than retail. There is a complete set of this guy that sells for £300, and it has a whole bunch of extra dirt apps applied to it. I definitely didn't spend that much over the 8 months I was collecting these guys up. Tell you what though, you want a centrepiece for your collection, there isn't much more attention grabbing than this guy. Unless you're one of those folks who've got HasLab Unicron, that'd probably get a bit more attention. Still, this is an amazing combiner that sure has plenty of issues along the way, but I can't argue with the results. It's just immense. Before I go, a big thank you to everyone who watched all this. I know I'm not the most energetic of YouTube Transformer reviewers, so I appreciate it if you get this far in the video. Please drop a like and subscribe, and I'm going to go find a much smaller and easier to review figure for the next review. Catch you later!